Hi, welcome to our lecture on inflation. In fact, this is the first part of this lecture. It will be dedicated to the definition, so we are going to say what inflation is about, and we will also discuss some basic stuff about how to measure inflation. As you can see in the slide, inflation is a process of rising of the general level of prices that results in a fall in the value of domestic money. There are a few important elements of this definition. First of all, inflation is defined as a process. So this is not about a single situation, single event when some price would go up. This is something of a more continuous nature. Secondly, the general level of prices. So we refer here to prices generally, not to a certain price that we could think of. Inflation doesn't relate to any particular single good, to any particular single price of some commodity. So we speak of the general level of prices. We see prices growing. Some of them grow faster, some of them are more slowly, but generally speaking, prices grow. How many prices does it take, and how much should they increase so that we could say, well, they generally increase? That is a difficult question, obviously. Now we've got various measures of inflation. So we are going to look at them briefly in our next slides. Nevertheless, remember, the result of inflation, the result of this rising in the general level of prices, the result is depreciation of the domestic currency. That means that your domestic currency loses what we call its purchasing power. With the same money, you can gradually buy less and less of goods and services. There are various measures of inflation in different countries. So, for instance, in the UK, the most popular measure of inflation would be retail price index or consumer expenditure deflator. In the USA, the most popular is consumer price index that we call CPI, but sometimes they also use producer price index or also gross national product or gross domestic product deflators. So these are possible choices when it comes to tools to measure inflation in the UK and in the USA. The differences between them depend on some more particular details. The general idea is more or less the same. So a price index measures the cost of a certain basket of goods. The difference is that for deflator, for instance, this basket contains goods that are produced according to the structure of gross, let's say, domestic product. So if we use GDP deflator, this basket is loaded with goods that are produced as part of GDP, and the shares in this basket are exactly the same as the shares that those goods take in the structure of gross domestic product. When it comes to consumer price index, for instance, we load this basket only with consumption goods and services. If we use producer price index, we take producer prices offered by producers. If we look at consumer price index, we take prices that are paid by consumers. You can see the example of such a basket of goods and services for Poland. Obviously, again, for foreign students, you can look at the data from your statistical office, and certainly you will find the similar graphics showing the basket of goods and services. So this is kind of a structure of expenditures made by households. And you can see that in Poland, the greatest part, nearly a quarter of all the expenditures, that's money spent on food and non-alcoholic beverages. The huge number 2 would be housing, water, electricity, gas, and other this kind of things, other fuels. So in fact, when you look at housing, electricity, energy expenditures, as well as food and non-alcoholic beverages, this is like 45% of all the expenditures, and the rest is dispersed over several other categories. Generally speaking, the less developed country, the bigger will be this share of food and housing in the total expenditures. In richer countries, those two categories, even though they are still main categories, they do not take such a big share in the total expenditures, allowing for spending money on some other goods, on some other categories. Obviously, this is the average picture of, you could say, picture of an average household. You can see, for instance, that for health, we in Poland generally on average spend slightly less than 6%. That doesn't have to be true for all households, obviously. So for instance, if you think of pensioners, or if you think of, let's say, your grandma and your grandpa living together, if they are older people, they may suffer from some diseases, therefore they could spend more on health, more than 6% of their expenditures, for instance. So as I already mentioned, different measures use slightly different concepts. The basket is different. The prices taken for the price index may be different. In Poland, we've got two major ways of measuring inflation. One is dominating, in fact. So we most often use this consumer price index. It's pretty similar to the American consumer price index. And when you hear about inflation, this is usually consumer inflation. So on the news, when you hear that inflation in Poland went up, for instance, to 4%, that usually means that this is CPI that was used for measuring the 4% increase. Economists use also gross domestic deflator to measure how prices change in the economy, but this is more general. This is more about all goods and services produced in the economy, not only those that we consumers are really interested. When you want to measure inflation, there are a few problems you need to solve. First of all, you need to choose the right price index. So that's the question, whether you want to measure prices that are paid by consumers or prices that are charged by producers, or perhaps you want to see how what changes are made with regard to prices of all goods produced in the economy. So this is about choosing the right price index. Then you should choose the right base year. So you need to load this basket, whichever basket you decided to choose, with goods and services from some year, and you need to calculate the value of this basket using prices from this base year. And then in other years you will recalculate the value of this basket using prices from, let's say, the next year. Since the contents of the basket, what is in the basket, stays the same, then if the value of the basket changes, this is because of prices, not because of what is in the basket. So you don't change quantities, you don't change goods or services in the baskets. The changes in the value is calculated as quantities times prices. If quantities stay the same, the value is different, therefore prices must have changed. That's how you measure changes in the general level of prices. Choosing the right base year. Well, we would like this base year to be the most, let's say, typical year, kind of boring year, a year that nothing strange or extraordinary happened, because that would be a good background for comparisons that we want to make. So for instance, if you look at this year 2020, so with this virus situation, certainly this is not the greatest base year, right? Because people behave in a strange way. For instance, they started to buy a lot of toilet paper. So you would have to put relatively a lot of toilet paper to the basket, which is not actually the typical thing. We do not usually buy that much of toilet paper or pasta or flour or other things. The next problem that you're gonna face, there are changes in the basket. The major idea is that basket should stay the same. I mean, you do not change what is in the basket, and you allow the value of this basket change because of the prices. So if value is prices times quantities, quantities stay the same, and if prices change, well, then you see the changes in the value. The problem is that your basket cannot last forever. You need to change it because consumption changes over time. So we can see there are some new goods that emerge and we buy them, like smartphones, for instance. In the basket that was created like 20 years ago, there wouldn't be any smartphone. Right now, you need to put smartphones in the basket because we buy them. There are some old goods, old-fashioned, outdated, we don't buy them anymore, so they need to be eliminated from the basket. The problem here, obviously, is that if you change the contents of the basket, then you lose comparability of your results. So this is something that statisticians must find some way to fix it, right? On one hand, we want to keep this basket stable so that we could see the influence of prices, but on the other hand, we need this basket to change over time to reflect our current consumption. Otherwise, the basket would measure the changes in the prices of the consumption structure that is no longer relevant to ours. One important and difficult to solve problem is the problem of differentiating between price changes and quality changes. You can see it very nicely with regard to cars, for instance. In the automobile industry, we see a lot of changes. Cars are better and better equipped. So what you buy now under the name of car actually contains much more systems, things, equipment that it used to have, let's say, 20 years ago. Obviously, cars nowadays are more expensive than they were 20 years ago. But the question now is, if the modern car is much more expensive than the old one? Is it entirely this difference in the price? Is it entirely inflation, or is it partly because of the fact that buying a car nowadays, you buy satellite navigation, for instance, or Bluetooth, or power steering, ABS system, some onboard computer. These are all things that are included in the price of a car. So the price grows not only because of inflation, but also because of the fact that under the name of a car, you get more than you used to get. So quality of a car increases, and therefore the price may also increase. So when you compare prices of cars 20 years ago and now, you need to understand that partly this change is thanks to inflation, but partly it is the quality that changed. Well, the question here is, if you want to measure inflation, you need to find out to what extent this change in the price can be assigned to quality changes, and to what extent this is simply the change in the price. Speaking of prices, there is a last question here when we want to talk about problems with measuring inflation. Which prices should be used? The same goods are sold at different prices in the economy. So if you look at a computer, a mobile, or a TV set, you can see it clearly that the price is within a certain range. So it is also a technical problem how to get information on prices. Which prices from which shops should be taken into account. So you need to be aware that measuring inflation is pretty complicated, and you have to face a lot of problems. So that was a kind of introductory part on inflation. In the next two parts, we are going to discuss the idea of inflation more thoroughly. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye.